This is a series of lectures on wit in architecture. Wit as in funny, haha, not the cerebral type. And specifically, wit as composed by the famous 20th century French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier. I'm happy to make space in my lectures for this exceptional and deeply weird building, the Harvard Lampoon building, or castle it's sometimes called, on the Harvard campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Analyzing it as a case study is critical in the learning curve of everyone that is generally unfamiliar with the concept of wit in architecture, at least as I'm using it. Again, the more lowbrow kind, not the high, as I explained in the introduction, lecture 1. The history of this type of lower brow wit in architecture has largely been one of in-jokes flying just below the historical radar. But this building is an exceedingly clear example of the phenomenon, and an exceedingly rare one in that the clients or owners were not only in on the joke, but implicitly requested it as a representation of themselves, their identity. In contrast, Le Corbusier's witty compositions were virtually all, in effect, Trojan horses, but never discovered by the owners. Let us start with an analysis of the Harvard Lampoon building. Prima facie, this small, even cute, triangular building seems to feature a prominent face on the front tower. It has 2 eyes, nose, mouth, 2 ears, and even a mustache, bow tie, and hat. The client in this case for this odd building was and still is the Harvard Lampoon Journal, a humor and satirical magazine at the school. At some point they sold naming rights to National Lampoon, and you'll have heard that many writers around Hollywood came from the Lampoon, especially The Simpsons. But this is not a historical analysis of the journal, only the architectural commission. And the architect was Edmund Wright, one of the founding 7 members of the original journal, many years before. This building provided the first dignified and standalone home for the publication on the Harvard campus, moving from rented offices. But Wright clearly saw it also as a design brief to be approached just as any satirical essay or lampooning cartoon that would have been composed for the journal itself. In this case, reflecting the core mission and identity of the journal. This is an exceptionally rare and unusual confluence of circumstances. The notion of wit as central to the client's identity, and thus the buildings. Wright composed a fairly complicated story here with this face, as we shall see. In most other instances, the mere semi-abstract physiognomic composition, physiognomic means face, composition on a face seems intended to be humorous or witty in passing. For example, here is Frank Furness, another architect, crafting a mustachioed gentleman on this Philadelphia carriage house of 1886. And just a bit later, another series of faces in the University of Pennsylvania Library of 1890. The humor of both of these Furness compositions is essentially, hey, he put a face on the building. Haha. That's it. And of course, you'll need to see my full lecture on the history of architects composing faces like this, at least since the Renaissance till today. My point is that there is a long, albeit intermittent and inglorious tradition flying just beneath the radar, where individual architects seem to be inventing it, or seeing it in journals following word of mouth, or perhaps inspired directly from their trips to Rome. I suspect most architects today would generally consider the phenomenon of including physiognomic projections on architecture or faces as belonging to a postmodern phenomenon, say from the 1970s on, and perhaps inspired directly from the Renaissance. But Boston in 1909 doesn't make any sense at first for this. But it does if you think of it more as an on-again, off-again, ongoing tradition, rarely spoken of. Here's another very comparable example of faces created from punctuation marks in the satirical journal Punch out of London in 1881. And in this case, there's no particular story of each face, just a delight in the cleverness of the idea. They're actually called emoticons in the caption, I was surprised to see. And the overlap with popular culture is way beyond quantification for me. But here are a couple of visual images popular at the time. The skull, which can be read in a couple different ways. The Harvard Lampoon magazine was founded in 1876 as a humor magazine inspired by the English weekly Punch of 1841. And that journal was in turn inspired by the original daily satirical journal Le Caravaggio, Either Or, 1832 in France. In fact, the English Punch called itself the English Le Caravaggio. Before we get to the specific character of the Harvard Lampoon, let's look briefly at the type of witty skewering some of these earlier journals did. A Caravaggio in French is a noisy mock serenade performed by a group of people to mock someone. Le Caravaggio, the journal, originally published caricatures, political cartoons, and reviews. Here's the 1834 visual skewering of King Louis Philippe as a pear. Unfortunately, political caricatures were outlawed at some point. Here is just one silly cartoon in an 1872 issue of Punch, the English journal, satirizing this short gentleman named Little Nimrod on the horse. Nimrod says, "Carries me splendidly, plenty of power, you see." His companion behind says, "Ha, quite so, but what have you done with the bathing machine?" So a bathing machine turns out to be one of these covered wagons drug out into the surf during Victorian times as a proper way for ladies to change in and out of their bathing attire, presumably without being seen. The highly specific inspiration for the creation of the Harvard Lampoon was the formation on campus of the feeble Harvard Art Club of about 1876. The club was to celebrate, quote, "the important part art plays in the refining and civilizing of nations." The club would emphasize, quote, "the importance of cultivating any talent, be it for literature, painting, sculpture, or in short, for any of the fine arts," end quote. But perhaps most preposterous and humorous to this fellow Ralph Curtis, who became the main founder, is it additionally claimed that, quote, "a spirit of dilettantism should be avoided." Curtis saw its members as decidedly incapable of appreciating either aesthetics or art. The Lampoon's motto, thus, Vanitas, was a play on Harvard's famous motto, Veritas, or truth, so vanity versus truth. The vanity, of course, was that of their ignorant, pompous, and clueless fellow students on campus. Oddly, both the subject of the journal and the same people who would buy each issue every week. Thus, I believe, the very first issue of the Harvard Lampoon, of course, made fun of the Harvard Art Club in a humorous story of one of these dilettantes' adventures on a dig. The illustration here is by none other than Edmund Wheelwright, again, the self-same architect of the future Lampoon building. Of course, another common target of satire was the main newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, you know, the stealing and returning of sacred objects, etc., etc. Hilarious. Here's another early cartoon in the journal of, quote, "a furious governor." I'm guessing governor is like the British slang, you know, governor, meaning important person, who says, "Tush, so they have suspended my son, eh? No dormitory to Harvard College from me." I'm guessing that's pretty timeless. Flash forward some 34 years or so later, and the Lampoon finally has enough financial success to move out of rented offices and into their own standalone building. One obvious choice for the architect of this new home was Edmund Wheelwright, who by this time was a respected Boston architect. So the challenge for Wheelwright, as he saw it, was how to embody the satiric and anti-establishment values of the publication in a work of architecture. And I just have to imagine towards the end of his career, this would have been an extreme passion project for him, a chance to relive his college days and all the joys and memories involved with the early Harvard Lampoon days. Nominally, this style is referred to as Flemish, or mock Flemish, I think they say, but that won't be our focus here. Now, we don't have Wheelwright's notes, sketches, or some journal as to his precise and private thoughts as to the meanings of its composition of the building. But we can make a reasonable and educated guess as to the somewhat obvious story he wanted to tell. And this analysis is largely backed up by at least one architectural historian who was himself a member of the Harvard Journal, William Donnell. You can find his and another member, Samuel Van Dam's, very nice analyses of the building online as part of the Massachusetts Historical Society lectures on the building. The satirical narrative of the building goes something like this. Yes, of course, the face on the building, with what could be described as a surprised or shocked look, was intentional. And it rather precisely represents just the same sort of dandy or stuffed shirt that the journal came into existence to make fun of. In this case, the very specific dilettante Harvard student with absolutely no interest or capacities in art, joining the Harvard Art Social Club in 1876. And again, in Wriight's illustration, he depicts just such a fellow on his architectural dig, complete with bowler hat. Now, this cartoon fellow doesn't have the trim mustache and very specific bow tie that is featured on the face of the building, but naturally enough, the fashion of the times, both from the 1870s and into the 1900s, when the building was designed, definitely both include bowler hats, prim mustaches, and bow ties. And you will come to see in these lectures that bow ties are a far easier style of tie to represent on an architectural facade. Supporting the reading that the stuffed shirt depicted on the front facade is the butt of the Lampoon's existence are the following additional circumstantial design elements of the building. It turns out that in the original blueprints for the building, Wright designed 2 steam pipes in the ears on the building to go off every hour. Steam coming out of ears is the prototypical cartoon method of denoting anger. And I assume this construct arose with steam trains. This is a Tom and Jerry cartoon, perhaps from the 50s or 60s or later. Please let me know if you can find any earlier examples, just to prove that small fact. Another curious aside worth mentioning is the fact that steam was charged to each building on campus on its return. So blowing steam after its use to heat a building was a way essentially of thumbing one's nose at the institution. It takes a second to figure out the meter was not at the beginning of the loop as it is today, but on the way back. Interestingly, since I was around on the Harvard campus in the 1990s, the Lampoon seems to have actually installed steam pipes, which they had running for this 60 Minutes interview. And in a profound feat of cutting-edge journalism, the interviewer was likely told they couldn't film the interior, but did the piece anyway.
Are you going to let us film in other rooms? These guys brought heavy equipment from New York. They'd really like to see additional rooms. Can we make that happen?
No, we have a strict no photography policy.
Completely understandable to retain a sense of mystery and reveal for when you're accepted to the club. Of course, we do have the internets now, and big surprise, there are out-of-copyright photos of the interior from when it was built and published. Well, actually, the main dining room upstairs is the most interesting room. There are more recent photos of this room floating around online, but it looks just like this, just college student messier and dimly lit. Don't know if they still have weekly dinners. The next important feature of the entire building design is that the head of this unfortunate stuffed shirt is depicted as having the body of a sphinx. There are 4 Dutch gables that can be read as haunches, zoomorphically placed. And there even appear to be the distinctive front arms of the cat. Though we generally associate the term sphinx with mystery, traditionally it has often also been closely linked to wisdom. Get it? This dapper idiot is likened to the great sphinx. Intelligent, like a lion, noble, no. And in one further turn, either actually intended by Edmund Wright or simply invented by successive students at Harvard as urban myth, the rear quarters of the building can be said to depict the hiney hole of said cat. It's referred to colloquially as the Sphinx's sphincter. Unfortunately, I never heard that anecdote during my time at Harvard, but only now I've come to hear of it through my research. Yes, it is totally sophomoric, but tell me you didn't laugh when seeing the butthole cut of the movie Cats. And now I might humbly suggest that this dangling bit below seems fairly phallic to my scholarly eyes. Again, did Wright intend that or not? Who's to say? Again, if he did intend it, he wasn't the first and not the last. Now, as I said in the beginning, a close analysis of meaning in this building is critical to this whole lecture series, irregardless of Le Corbusier's interaction with it. However, it just so happens that Le Corbusier almost certainly did encounter this building. He was hired towards the end of his career to design the Carpenter Center for the Arts on the Harvard campus, which will also be examined in depth in Lecture 14, where he could have seen this building. It's only a couple of blocks away from his site and immediately adjacent to Jose Luis Serret's Hollyoaks Center in Harvard Square that Jose Luis Serret likely would have made him tour. Serret was essentially his on-campus chaperone and largely responsible for the commissions in the first place. If you had been at all convinced by the body of evidence presented in these lectures that Le Corbusier may have had an inclination in his long career to surreptitiously compose faces on his architecture, then this encounter with the building would have been a pointed historical event that I wish I could have been there for, fly on the wall and all that. And we will come back to Le Corbusier's design at Harvard in a future lecture, but also his possible influence by the Harvard Lampoon for his very next project for a church in Firminy, France. Again, I'll be randomly releasing these videos, and the current index is included in the description. In short, Le Corbusier and the Lampoon's architect, Edmund Wright, engaged in precisely the same modes of creation, albeit absolutely independently of one another. The seemingly impossible or deeply inadvisable creation of a fairly complex story or narrative in a work of architecture. Again, in this case, the narrative is wholly synchronous with the client and the identity of the building. In Le Corbusier's case, they seem to have served as methods of deep introspection in historical recordings of his life for posterity. While you may feel it is impossible that Le Corbusier would do such things, at least let us agree that at least one other architect has done precisely this. And even more tantalizing, I will suggest in Lecture 14, in my grand reveal, and finale of this entire lecture series, that it is conceivable, based on compounding circumstantial evidence, that Le Corbusier may have even emulated the Harvard Lampoon building in the design of one of his final projects.